We have more skilled work to be done than we have skilled workers. It is a technology economy, and is a technology economy increasingly over time. And the nature of technological change has been such that it's created so much demand for skilled workers that we haven't kept up. ATM machines grew through the 70s and 80s and had a huge impact on banking, but it actually, demand for tellers didn't go down at all, despite ATMs clearly replacing a lot of work that tellers did. What it did is it changed the nature of the work that they did, and they focused more on that in-person work, helping customers directly. It also, by the way, lowered the cost of opening a bank.
Okay, we're here with Adam Ozimek. Adam, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Drew. Glad to be here.
Awesome. Hey, I'd love to just take a minute, if you could maybe for the audience's sake, introduce yourself, tell us about how you ended up as chief economist at the Economic Innovation Group, and tell us what the group does.
Sure. I'm chief economist at the Economic Innovation Group, and we are a public policy think tank focused on improving economic dynamism. So how do we get more startups? How do we get more entrepreneurs? How do we get more fast-growing companies? How do we make the economy more competitive? Those sorts of questions, and what are the public policy approaches we can take to address those issues? Came here after a career in economics, and I was in consulting and forecasting, and then worked at a tech company, and ready to get involved in policy.
That's fantastic. There's so much change and market volatility we've experienced, especially over the last few years. Maybe, I guess you could share with us, what are some of the most fascinating labor trends to evolve over the next 2 to 3 years based on what we know now?
Well, I would say that the growth of remote work is obviously a huge change over the last 2 to 3 years. It was growing slowly before the pandemic, and then obviously skyrocketed when people were stuck at home and businesses were trying to figure out how to adapt, how to keep working. And a lot of them found that it worked for them a lot better than they thought. And so many firms have been sticking it out and doing remote work for the long haul. And workers seem to enjoy it. Some of them do. Enough of them that a substantial portion of the labor market is probably going to be remote going forward. And so that's a major labor market trend. It's not going anywhere. And if anything, we're going to see more of it as startups are disproportionately remote, embracing remote first. So that should continue to push the economy towards remote working.
What do you make of businesses that are mandating people back, where the whole RTO, return to office movement?
Businesses mandating a return to office, some of them are probably doing the right thing, and some of them are probably doing the wrong thing. There's no single answer here. There are going to be firms and occupations that need to be in person, and there are going to be firms and occupations that are best done remotely. And a lot of employers just don't know. They don't know what they're going to end up having to do in the long run, and they're taking a guess at it. But they're going to be facing a lot of forces that push them one way or the other. So it's not simply a matter of choice. Just because a manager or business owner prefers to work in person, that doesn't mean that their firm is going to be in person, because in the long run, they're going to face labor market competition for their workers, and they're going to face product market competition. So it's really a question of what is the profit maximizing way to work, taking into consideration labor and productivity and output. In the long run, that will be the determinant as compared to the short term, which is sort of manager and boss's guesses.
Yeah, absolutely. You just mentioned some of the forces, is whether it's labor forces or economic product forces. When you think about the forces behind labor, what can you maybe dive deeper into what those forces are?
Sure. Workers have different preferences. Some workers want to be in the office every day. Some workers want to be in the office a few days a week, and some workers never want to be in the office. And so employers are facing pressure from their workforce in terms of how do those workers want to work? And for those who want to be remote, some of them place a significant dollar value on it. So it's an important career consideration for them. And employers who are working especially if they're working in an occupation or working in a field where some employers are managing to make remote work and they aren't, they're going to face labor market competition as people try to hire their workers away. And so they're going to have to respond to that one way or another.
Makes sense. So there's a lot of tension right now. Like, you can almost feel it, the employer relationship. We'll go deeper in some other questions about this too, but it doesn't feel good. There's a lot of that. There's a lot of that pressure. And the question is the employer relationship broken? Is it Has it been broken all along? Is it just natural? Like, how do you respond to that comment, the employer-employee relationship is broken? And what do you attribute to your beliefs?
Someone feeling that could be responding to a variety of different trends in the labor market. First, they could be responding to this tension created by remote work where employees want one thing and the manager wants the other thing. And so they may be feeling the tension created by that return to office. And that's something, like I said, in the long run is going to be sorted out by competition.
Yeah.
And they may face startups that are able to do it remote, or it may turn out that the workers are wrong and this is an occupation that's going to end up being in person. So the long run is for workers to shift out of that occupation. So there's a variety of ways for that tension to be resolved. Other factors are we have had a very tight labor market over the last 2 years. And so that's caused a high quit rate, high rate of turnover. People are looking for better job opportunities because they've been able to find them, especially on the lowest skilled part of the labor market, which is not where employers are used to having to deal with it being difficult to find workers. And I think part of this was a short-term pandemic thing. There were policies put in place during the pandemic, whether it's stimulus or expanded UI, and then also layer on top of that some fears related to working during the pandemic or worse working conditions. Some workers pulled back, and so you had this decrease in labor supply, especially among the least skilled, and that created a temporary, like a very acute labor market shortage. And we're not going to see a return to that. So that's getting better over time. But what we are going to see is in the long run, I think firms are going to be dealing with tighter labor markets than they are used to, especially at the lower end. And it's really the end of a 10-year period from the Great Recession up until the pre-pandemic where labor markets were pretty soft. They were pretty weak. And that's most acutely felt among low-skilled workers. And I think policymakers have learned that they can actually run the labor market hotter than they thought. And so long run, there's going to be hopefully more competition for low-skilled workers, for those trying to hire them. That'll be good for wages, good for wage growth, good for wage inequality, good for working and employment. But I think some employers are going to feel that as a bit of a tension because they're used to a world where I'm trying to hire low-skilled workers. I'm going to post a job opening and 100 people are going to line up and I'm going to have my pick and I'm going to pay them not very well. And I don't think that is really sustainable. And the absence of that is going to feel tough to some businesses in the short run. But society-wide, that it's better that we're not in that world and we're not going to be, hopefully.
Adding to the stress, to the tension, clearly the for the 24/7 media monster to continue, there's a lot of fear-based media out there, and we're seeing this around like artificial intelligence and are the machines going to take our jobs and displacement of work, right? A couple months ago, the World Economic Forum put out a report where it estimated that probably about 80 million jobs will be displaced over the next several years because of AI. That same report showed 90 million. I would argue it's probably going to be more than 100 million jobs will be created from AI. If machines continue to take on these more transactional objective components of work, if AI proliferates, what are humans left to do?
So it's a great question. And I think that there are a variety of ways that AI can impact us as workers. Its impact on tasks, specific tasks. So AI might replace some tasks that you do, and that frees up your time to specialize in other tasks. So I think in terms of things like organization and writing drafts and research, there are a lot of areas where AI will be a great tool and it'll increase productivity. And there's going to be a mix of impacts. Some jobs might find that they're replaced entirely. Some workers might find that 20% of their work is replaced and they become much more productive as a result. I don't really worry about the economy's ability long run to employ skilled people. And I think that's one of the interesting fears is that this is going to come for skilled workers because it's coming for like analytical work, it's coming for writing work, it's coming for research work. This is in contrast to most of the automation which we've seen over most of the 20th and 21st century, which was automating more manual labor type work.
Yes.
The automation of a car factory being a big example where stuff used to be done by hand and now it's done by machine. So the sort of knowledge work automation is not something we're as used to seeing. And I think it's making some people a little bit nervous, but in reality is increasingly over time and the nature of technological change has been such that it's created so much demand for skilled workers that we haven't kept up. And the way you know that is that the wage premium that a skilled worker earns all over an unskilled worker is historically very high, right? So that wage premium reflects the relative dearth of skilled workers and the relative surplus of low skilled workers. And if what AI does is it replaces some of the work that skilled workers do, that should help lower the skilled wage premium. And it's a balance of against the trends we've seen for the last few decades, which was more of an automation of low skilled work. I'm not worried about the ability of skilled workers to find more stuff to do. And I think to the extent that it replaces some of the tasks that they do, that's a great thing for productivity. It's a great thing for the economy overall.
And what sort of impact do you think that the automation of the unskilled tasks, right, essentially freeing humans up to do more meaningful work, what sort of impact in the long run do you think that's going to have on compensation or value of the worker?
In the long run, increases in productivity should translate to increases in earnings and wages. And the bigger impact it has on automating away stuff that we do, the bigger impact it's going to have on productivity and wages. So I expect that to be a positive thing in the long run. We've been through periods of mass automation before. I'm doubtful that AI is going to replace more workers than the tractor did. For example, we used to be an agricultural society where the vast majority of people were in agriculture, and the rise of the tractor and a variety of tools automated the farm so that we didn't need to do that anymore. And it's hard to look back on that and see it as a mistake. That was huge progress of human well-being and earnings as a result of this.
Yeah. And what you just talked about with the tractors, I think is where we get this notion of we're in a knowledge economy. Before we were in like an agrarian doing economy, and there was this big shift with computing. And so do you think we're on the cusp of transitioning into another era? Are we going from a knowledge economy into a different type of economy? Or are we just going to call it knowledge economy forevermore?
Yeah, I don't see any transition away from a knowledge economy. What's a theoretical possibility is that AI is so good at knowledge work that it does most knowledge work, and that there's relatively few humans employed in knowledge work, which would free up humans to be involved in other types of services, right? More in-person services, that kind of thing. I don't really foresee that. I think that sometimes what happens is when technology moves faster than we expected for a short period of time, there's a tendency to project that forward into infinity. So we have had 2 years of AI progress that exceeded expectations. And that's great. It's good. It's exciting. And I think it's to the point where there's going to be commercial impacts, obviously. But that's not a reason to say, obviously, then project this linearly into the future. We're just going to continue to improve at this pace.
Sure.
I think that there will be more limits to technology than a lot of people are thinking based on naively extrapolating recent growth rates in the future.
Yeah. I want you to go on a little journey with me. If we think about the tractor analogy, right? At some point you had horse and plow, and there was skill associated with riding that horse and plow. And then the technology, whether it's the plow mechanics or something else, evolve, and it takes less skill to do that. Then we jump on a tractor. Tractor was probably hard to drive. You had a stick shift, you had all this other crap going on. And then the tractor became more evolved. And then at some point you don't need as much skill to drive the tractor. And then we move from agrarian into this knowledge economy. But I use the concept of being in sales. If you were a B2B software salesperson, you use Salesforce or any CRM, and it's automated the process so much that the amount of skill needed, it actually is more about being a member of the assembly line to generate a sale than it is about to have skill. So there's almost like this, I see this phenomenon of evolution that as technology proliferates, a trade that may have been viewed as skilled is essentially worn down to a certain extent. And then you can have a non-skilled workers in there. Am I just like seeing the world oddly, or does that happen?
Sure. No, that happens. I think I'm not sure that it exactly applies to the tractor, because by the same token, you also need a modern tractor is a complex machine itself, right? There's a lot to know about it. Sometimes there's even programming involved and really complex computers as part of these tractors. So I'm not sure it applies exactly there, but there are plenty of examples of what you're talking about. The whole thing, the cobbler made the shoe by hand and he could stitch every part and he did the whole thing. And it was this very expensive, very slow, hand handcrafted artisanal thing. And then automation allowed it to be done in a lot smaller, discrete, lower skilled steps. And so the average skill level of someone who is working on the shoe over time went down dramatically. But I think we lose a lot by simply focusing on the impact on the shoe worker. And we should think what had a greater impact on society, the de-skilling of the makers of shoes or the availability of shoes for everyone falling costs over time. Right. If you rewind the clock back to the 19th century, people would have a few items of clothes, right? And that would be it. And the rise of automation in textiles was a tremendous benefit to society in terms of having clothes not be a major part of the budget and increased welfare of households. Just such a huge change that focusing on the producers themselves misses most of what happens there.
Yeah, love that. Love that. Talk track makes a lot of sense. Let's talk about the next generation of workers. So we have AI, it's coming in. We're relying on machines to do the more objective transactional components of work. What I just love is counterintuitively, as machines proliferate, human judgment, the need for human judgment actually increases, because it's like now all these machines, they got to make sure they're working right. And so clearly the next generation of workers will need to maybe have different skills, new skills, better skills. What do you think that looks like over the next, let's call it 25 years?
Yeah, it's a great question. I certainly imagine that the need for robotics programming is going to remain strong. It's interesting to consider what a programmer will do, how that will change.
Yeah.
It's hard to say what the net impact on the demand for programming will be, because it's clear already how ChatGPT has been a huge help to programmers in terms of helping them figure things out and code things out and code things faster. And does that faster coding mean there's significantly less demand for programmers, or does it just mean the job of a programmer changes and you become more of like a product manager, thinking more like holistically about what it is, the thing that you're creating? Yeah. Focus more maybe on user interface and design and usability and stuff like that. I'd say all that stuff is up in the air, especially because we're so early in the commercial application of AI. It's not clear what's going to shake out, who's going to be, for the people who are using the skills most directly impacted, it's unclear who's exactly going to be augmented, who's going to be replaced, and what are the activities that we're going to see growing demand up for.
What do you think it says about, maybe speak a little bit about hard versus soft skills?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the balance of demand for hard versus soft skills is going to tend to lean more towards soft skills in the future. I think that the things that machines are going to be least good at is being an actual person and the sort of emotional intelligence and sales, right? It's going to be very difficult. Even most humans don't do sales great, right? That's just having the intelligence level of a human is not something that makes you necessarily great at sales, right. Nor is it a matter of pure processing power. Like, we don't think of what makes someone a great salesperson as mapping very closely with IQ. I don't think a 200 IQ person might not be a good salesman at all. They might be a terrible salesman. And so I don't see AI necessarily taking that over, especially when we're talking about in-person stuff. What are the areas where it's really helpful to sales to be person to person, to be in face to face with someone? That seems like an area where it's going to be hard for it to have an effect on the demand there.
Yeah, I think what you're hinting at too is anytime where there's fear of automation, AI, robotics displacing, when you actually talk to the folks that are building it, the roboticists or the people that are building the software, or even the people that are legitimately in the role, they look at it as augmentation, scaling the individual, right? Empowering them. And I think that example that you just shared about the salesperson, it's like the final stages of the sales process, the relationship parts of the sales process, it's allowing them to do that better and maybe allowing them to work more deals at once, right? With that.
Yeah, definitely. For a discrete example of this, you can look at the ATM machines. At all, despite ATMs clearly replacing a lot of work that tellers did. What it did is it changed the nature of the work that they did, and they focused more on that in-person work, helping customers directly. It also, by the way, lowered the cost of opening a bank. Which made it easier for more banks to open, which in turn helps support demand for sellers, labor demand for tellers. It is complicated how that plays out.
Yep. And that is a tried and true, that's an example that I've heard before. It makes a lot of sense. Let's shift our conversation a bit, because I know you've had some experience thinking in the space of freelance and fractional work. We've seen a significant rise, right, in the popularity of freelance and fractional work. It was a trend that was already happening, right? Pandemic accelerated, exacerbated. Some folks can make the claim that maybe we've swung the pendulum too far in the freelance and fractional, maybe not, right? There's so much fervor around it. Do you think it's possible to build a company of 100% freelance or fractional workers?
It's possible. It's definitely possible. Does that include the CEO? Is the CEO a freelancer or the I have heard of part-time executives on the contract. So I suppose anything's possible. It's not very common, but freelancers can play a substantial role. And it's not, if you rephrase how you describe it, it becomes a lot easier to imagine. So like you can outsource entire tasks or entire departments to freelancing. And that sounds like a radical step. But if I were to say to you, we don't have in-house counsel.
Right.
We have a law firm we work with. That's outsourcing production to someone outside the company. And that doesn't seem that radical or scary, right? But it's a lot of the same thing. It's taking an activity inside the firm, moving it outside the firm. And there's a gray line between freelancing and outsourced services. I can tell you sometimes when you think you're hiring a freelancer online, they'll have a whole team behind them. And you'll meet the team and you'll say, oh, great, I thought this was just a freelancer, but actually this is more like a small agency and they've got a whole team supporting them. There's not a hugely clean differentiation there.
Yeah. It's funny. There's probably almost a spectrum there, because on the flip side, when it comes to like labor regulations and contractors and are they employees and are they not, I thought it was really interesting to see earlier this year, Upwork announced that they're now allowing for full-time contracts on their platform. I get excited about what this means for just the employee-employer relationship at a macro level. At the same time, with what's happening in the economy, there's a lot of chatter around like union activity and everything else. What do you think this says about the notion of at-will employment, especially here in the US? Is the meaning of that changing, or is at-will employment at risk?
I don't think so. I think at-will employment it's one of the ingredients in our dynamic labor market, what helps make our economy productive. And I think an erosion of at-will employment, treating the employment relationship as something that's very difficult to sever. It's hard to raise the cost of firing someone without raising the cost of hiring someone. And when you raise the cost of hiring someone, you reduce the demand for labor. So it's not something I think we should do lightly. And I don't see a significant risk that at-will employment on the whole goes anywhere. I think it's important when we're talking about freelancing to differentiate between different types of freelancers. So the BLS surveys contract workers, and it's something like 83% of them, it's the preferred way that they want to work. When you ask them, like, they're doing it because this is what they want, right? And it's often portrayed as some sort of employer dodge of obligations. We have obligations to workers. We want to dodge them. So we're going to hire them on contract. It's imposed by employers. But the vast majority of contract workers, again, by the BLS's own data, that's the way that they want to work. And when you look at surveys of why people choose to work that way, it provides them with a lot of flexibility that you can't replicate in a 9-to-5 job. Like, they have an ability to scale up and down how much work they do in a given week. They work for themselves. They determine not just like when they work, but where they work. And it's just something that people value. Now, on the other hand, of course, you do have businesses who are trying to avoid labor obligations by misclassifying workers as contract workers. So it certainly exists in the economy, and both types of work exist. But it's important not to conflate the two. And you should when you're thinking about skilled freelancers, you shouldn't be thinking about mostly people who its work status is being imposed upon them. In contrast, most of them are choosing that work status because they value that type of working.
Just going a little deeper on that, is it a paradox in some ways, maybe, or is it I choose to work this way because that's the way business is? Yes, of course, I wanted to have my own freedom and flexibility because I'd rather not be on the other side because it stinks over there. Is it truly just that, oh, we're all out here and of course we want to work on our own because we love the flexibility, but it's because of the condition inside the business? Is that the wrong way to think about it?
There's usually, for any occupation, there is a traditional employment option. Right? And
Hmm.
so when you ask people, would you prefer to work how you are working now as a freelancer, or would you rather be all else equal working for in a
Mm,
traditional employment relationship? It's not about the opportunities not being there. It's about their preference for it. And in surveys I've done with this, you dig in and you ask them why, what is it that they value about it? And the story stands out. They value the flexibility. They value
got it.
that way of working. And especially before the pandemic, when you wanted to be remote, freelancing was the best way to find remote work,
Yep.
because if you're working with multiple employers, if you're not reporting to the business and working inside the office, they were much more comfortable on both sides working remotely. So it was disproportionately a way to have the flexibility that came with remote work.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So we have this concept of a worker. They could be full-time, W-2 employed. They could be contracted. We have some fractional workers. What's the value of a human in the work context? What sort of variables should we be considering to be like, what is this worth? How should we think about that?
That's a very big context dependent question. I guess you have to be asking that in comparison to what. So if you're an employer, what is the value of
Yes.
having a human role compared to what's the best capital replacement for it? Or how much do we lose by not conducting that business activity? If you're talking about what's the value of someone in marketing, you're asking relative to some alternatives. One would be not doing the marketing. So then you have to ask yourself, what's the ROI on that activity? And the other would be outsourcing it, right, to someone else. And in some roles, you have the option of just fully replacing with capital. So
Yeah.
it's completely context dependent. There is no one answer to it. It's really about what is the opportunity cost of not doing that work and the other ways to get it done.
If we go a little deeper on that and we think about performance measurement standards, you had talked earlier about how really like the soft skills are the areas where we're going to be indexing more, right? And needing more and coveting more. And I would hypothesize then placing a higher value on inside organizations as we perceive, regardless of which profession or career track you are on. However, as a business society, our ability to actually correlate or invalidate performance and metrics off of those human abilities, we're unsophisticated. There's a lot that has to change there. What do you think the future of performance measurement looks like in light of that? What are some big advancements you think that have to happen?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's actually hardest, I'm sure, for the soft skills part of it to actually measure the skills themselves on a real time basis. And on other skills, you have a greater ability to track, right? AI improves this as well, because if everyone's working in a smart ecosystem, we're all working in Microsoft Teams, for example, and Microsoft Teams is constantly observing what your contributions are. They're already using AI to summarize email chains, and
Right.
it's very easy to imagine AI summarizing who's contributed to this document, who's contributed to this presentation. And just if AI is going to be your co-pilot, if AI is going to be always helping you, then AI is always going to be watching you. And I think that depends on whose perspective you're coming from, the opportunity or the threat to have AI do an assessment of what the worker's contribution is and how much they're contributing to the firm. That's less about soft skills than it is about output and
Sure.
contribution.
Yep.
On the soft skills side, more often than not, I think you just have to focus on results. So you're not going to measure how well a salesman does at making a customer feel valued. You don't have an output of that, but you will have a measure of how many sales that person closes. And that's probably the level of measurement you'll be stuck at, unless AI gets a lot better at judging our interactions and our emotions and things like that.
I think that there's a bit of a revolution happening amongst workers. And I think a lot of it is being inspired by the fractional freelance movement. The conversation that we just had about performance measurement, right? We're no longer working at a company our whole career. We're changing in and out. I see this growing need for the individual to have more control over their performance metrics and be able to, there's a portability notion to this. I want to build up my resume, not just with words I put on my resume, but validated performance data. And I think that the technology world's about to meet that. Do you think that we could see a trend where we're, as workers, relying less on businesses to subsidize our career development, and that will shift to be more something that the worker drives and the worker subsidizes?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I think actually the biggest potential there is probably for global remote work, and especially in developing countries. One of the advantages of digital labor markets now on various platforms is you do have like outcomes measures that help indicate your sort of success rate, your value as a worker. And those are extremely valuable proof points when you're trying to hire someone outside of your labor market and sometimes in a different country. So if you're trying to hire a programmer in your local metro area, you can look at their resume and see where they went to college and have a sense of what that means in terms of what kind of education they got. You can look at their other employers and not only know, oh, they work for Google, that's really cool, or oh, they work for some nothing tech company, that's less impressive. So we have an ability to gauge the sort of quality signifiers on a resume, and also to use networks to validate whether those things are true. Did they actually work at Google? Did they really go to Harvard? We can check those things. If you're trying to hire a programmer from Kenya, you have a lot less ability to use the normal signifiers. You don't know what the good schools and bad schools in Kenya are. You don't know what the really impressive employers are and what the not impressive employers are. And even if you don't really have a great way to validate any of this information. So when you're hiring globally, you have so much more need for, like you said, owning your own sort of performance metrics. And I think remote digital labor markets are an important component of that, because you get to see whether someone has been successful at the jobs that they've done. So it's a way of hiring that lends itself more to freelance work, so that you accumulate lots of little experience to prove, hey, I have 20, 30, 40 clients and they've all found the work to be really great. You accumulate this success trail, and that becomes a huge asset to you in terms of finding remote work around the world in a way that would be very difficult to replicate without the sort of on-platform measures of outcome-based performance.
So just want to challenge a thought coming from the HR tech space. Your SAT scores, for instance, are really only predictive of your first year college performance. More and more, I think that if we're finding that relying on somebody's where they went to college or the job they had before could be an indicator, but is likely not a high predictor of on-the-job performance in your business. So what other things should we be looking at, if not those network effect things, which I think there's a lot of credit there, but like, what else should we be looking at to see if somebody could actually perform at our company?
It's very role specific, because if you think, there are a lot of roles where creativity is the most important thing. And when you're interviewing, you should be really gauging someone's creativity, asking them open-ended, freewheeling, challenging questions to gauge their ability to be creative and to think on the spot. There are other roles where that's not really important at all. And what really matters is their concentration and their diligence and their attention to detail. So I think you should be thinking about what's the role and what are the needed skills and how do I have a conversation with someone to get that. And an important point that comes from Tyler Cowen and Daniel Gross in their new book is to, if you're looking to hire people in specific roles, to give some consideration to how a neurodivergent person might actually thrive in a role like that and might not stand out to in an interview. But for example, someone with autism can really thrive at a variety of roles that require high diligence and attention to detail and focus. And they may not stand out in an interview, but they may have skills that are really super valuable. And so keeping that in mind, what is it that I need for this role? What kind of person do I need? And don't get distracted by sometimes things that happen in an interview that might seem valuable, but really aren't important for the role. Someone like, am I trying to find out if this person has the actual skills that really matter? Or am I trying to find out if this person is charming me in the moment? It's important to look past that kind of surface stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I love that you brought up the point on neurodiversity, and there's leverage to be had in the market, right? The neurodivergent population is wrong how unemployed that sector of the population is. And there's so much magic to be had. I say that not just as a corporate executive, but also as the father of a child who is neurodivergent, and just looking at like how unsophisticated we are as a business society to do that. I'm glad that you brought that up. I see a trend beyond EQ to neuro-based leadership. I think it's super important that we are aware of those things. Adam, it was really great to chat with you today. Is there anything else you would like to share with the audience before we wrap up?
No, I'm glad to be here, and thanks for having me. Good
Absolutely.
conversation.
Awesome. Thanks, Adam.
Thanks.